Before Michael joins me on stage, a few points as to how tonight is going to work. As advertised, there's going to be substantial time given to Q&A after the talk. We hope tonight is a helpful contribution to what I believe is a very important conversation we need to continue having as a community. My encouragement is that you do take the opportunity in the Q&A to engage with Michael, but that you do wait until that time with your questions and comments. Over supper, there will be the opportunity for individual conversations. That might be with the people who brought you, with someone else you know. Michael will also be making himself available over that time. This evening had its genesis several years ago, actually, when John Anderson, former Deputy Prime Minister, who is here tonight, and it is good to have him, met Michael at the Lausanne Conference in Cape Town, and thus began a series of conversations and contacts which led to Michael's involvement in the Armidale Diocese. Michael is the International Director of Ravi Zacharias Ministries. He is also a Joint Director of the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. In previous lives, he has worked for the Lord Chancellor's Department. He has researched in law and economics at Sheffield University, where he has also taught moral philosophy. He has lectured for the International Seminar for Jurisprudence and Human Rights and has been the Professor in Residence at the Wolfsberg Executive Institute. Michael currently lives in Oxford with his wife Anne and their 3 children. I am also told on good authority that he is keen on a new concept in social media, which he might explain to us, called You Tweet Face. Without further ado, would you please warmly welcome him to the stage.
Well, it's a privilege for me to be able to speak to you this evening. By the end of it, you may not feel quite the same yourself. I have to say I have been dotting around a little bit. I arrived from the UK 2 days ago. Yesterday I spoke in Tamworth early in the morning, and then late in the evening I actually arrived in Armidale in the early hours of this morning. Got up to have an early morning breakfast meeting, which I was speaking at this morning. And now we're going to do another late night, and then I get to have the fun of waking up early again tomorrow morning to speak at the 7:30 a.m. service at the cathedral, and then the later one at 9 or 10, whenever it is. So if I fall asleep while I'm talking to you, that's not because I'm bored with my material, it's just sheer physical freedom. Of course, you may feel, especially if you're a student, you may need to catch up on some sleep, so I'll try to speak not too loudly so as to interrupt you. Now, this question that we have tonight is actually a really pressing one. And I am going to be looking a little bit, and we'll be talking a little bit about definitions and understandings of words, and I hope you'll bear with me through that. But sometimes when we misunderstand the nature of a term or a word, it's not just that we begin to misunderstand each other, but we also run the risk of sometimes misunderstanding something which may be actually very significant. A couple of years ago, I was speaking to the board of a company, and we were having food afterwards, and the guy who was hosting the evening said, "Michael, I want to share this story with you because I know you'll love it." He says, one of my best friends took his son to be interviewed by one of England's most prestigious schools. And the way that particular school interviews, it's an all-boys school, is the father will bring his son into the headmaster's study, and the headmaster will sit on one side of the desk, the son will sit on the opposite side of the desk across from the headmaster, and the father has to sit behind his son. So the father is there in the room, he hears everything, but he can't see his son. Does that make sense? He can't give him any clues or anything like that. And on the basis of that interview, you're accepted or rejected. And the interview is going very well, and the father's very pleased with how well the whole thing's going. And then the headmaster asked a rather unusual question. He looked at this boy and he said, "What is it that terrifies you the most?" Now, that's an interesting question. And the boy paused and then looked at the headmaster and said, "Oblivion." Now, the headmaster was clearly visibly surprised by this answer. I mean, now, oblivion has a shade of meanings. It can mean to cease to exist in someone's mind or memory. That's what most politicians live in fear of, becoming oblivious. It can mean to fail to recognize. It could mean to continue to exist in some kind of strange state of existlessness. But however you define it, it isn't good. And the father sitting there, shocked by this answer, and the headmaster was clearly surprised by it. The rest of the interview was a breeze, and the boy got accepted into the school. And now the father's driving his son back home, but instead of celebrating, thinking, oh, wow, my son got into the school, I'm so proud of him, all he can think of is my son lives in terror of oblivion. And so as the miles go by, he's waiting for a moment. And when the opportune moment comes, when he feels it's about right and the conversation feels relaxed, he says to his son as calmly as he can, you know when the headmaster asked you what terrifies you the most and you said oblivion, why did you say that? And the boy looked at his father with a very quizzical expression and said, well, that was the name of that really scary ride at the fun fair last week. Now, you see what was happening. The headmaster detected a profundity in that young boy's answer that, strictly speaking, actually wasn't there. And that's one of the reasons why, when we come to talk about some issues, it's very important we just take a step back and think about what it is we're actually talking about. Now, this issue about how we understand tolerance and also about the nature of the Christian faith itself was a thought that was first triggered in me quite a few years ago when I received a letter from what was then called the British Home Office, which was the British government department, which was in charge of issues of civil justice and law within the United Kingdom. And underneath their logo, as most government departments have, I don't know if this happens in Australia, but certainly in the UK, most government departments have their logo and a little logo, and then like a little strapline underneath. And the strapline said, building a safe, just, and tolerant society. And the more I thought on that, the more I began to wonder whether it's only actually possible to have two out of those three things. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. Now, the reason why I want to accommodate from that angle is that I think for a lot of people, they have very serious and very legitimate questions about the Christian faith, and it goes something like this, and it's in the form of a moral complaint. If the Christian faith is genuinely loving, forgiving, and all this kind of stuff, why is it that it also seems to be either A, so judgmental, if it's also meant to be so full of love? I mean, isn't it somehow inherently contradictory? Isn't it trying to say two very different things which mutually exclude each other, and you're either going to go one way or another, but either one way, you're either going to have a problem with God, or you're going to have a problem with the Bible, or you're going to have to have some kind of truncated Christian faith, or even better, this is a good argument to get rid of the Christian faith altogether. So it's a very powerful question the more you think about it. Now, the issue for me, starts with how we need to start thinking about tolerance. So let me just start by saying a few things about that word. Now, classically and historically, tolerance was a positive virtue, but it's come to be negatively defined in modern culture. Now, there are two ways of dealing with this issue which are rhetorically opposite, but actually conceptually the same, and let me just try and map them out for you. Let me just take this idea that it's come to be negatively defined. So imagine after this particular talk, you decide, you know what, I'd like to go and talk to this guy a bit more. And you come up to me and you say, Michael, not only am I a student here, I'm one of the best chefs in this entire place. And, why don't you come back to my room? We're going to have a late night supper. I'm going to whip up something for you to eat, and then we're going to have a long talk. And that's what happens. And then tomorrow morning, you decide to come along to the cathedral to hear what I have to say there. And I'm talking to someone, and you're standing behind me waiting to say hello. And the person who's talking to me says to me, I hear you went to have a late night supper with a student last night. And I say, yeah, that's right. And they say, was the food any good? And I say, yeah, it was tolerable. And then they say to me, well, did you enjoy talking to them? And I said, yeah, I could tolerate their company. And you're standing behind me and you hear that. How would you respond? Would you be sitting there thinking, wow, next time Michael Ramsden's in Armadale, I'm definitely going to have him round again. Can't wait to feed him once more. I'm going to introduce him to all my friends. Would that be your response? And the answer is no. Because tolerance, as we understand it right now, I say, is negatively defined. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary, I think, the last time I checked, has 22 different negative definitions for tolerance. If you're an engineering student here, tolerance is the amount of error you can build into a system before it collapses. Medical tolerance is your ability to fight off some unwanted, disease before you finally give in. Tolerance is something which is very negative. That means if I were to say, hey, I tolerate you, or I am prepared to tolerate you, what am I saying? What I'm saying is, you're wrong. But you're either too stupid or too stubborn for me to talk to. So I'm going to say nothing. And I will put up and tolerate you. That's because I'm so kind. I'm merciful, gentle. You may call me Michael the Merciful. And because I'm such a wonderful person, out of my goodness, I will put up with your badness. That's what I'm saying. I'm actually claiming something which sounds good about me, but at your expense. There is something, therefore, fundamentally different between me saying I'm prepared to tolerate you and me saying I respect you. Because when I say I respect you, I'm actually now saying something fundamentally different to the idea of tolerance. When I talk about respect, I'm now saying there's something about you that demands I treat you in a particular way. And it's actually to your benefit. That makes sense? There's actually something within you that deserves and demands that I respond and treat you in a particular way. And if I fail to do that, then there's something wrong with me. And I'd like to suggest to you this evening that we're in a fundamental need within our culture right now to recover the concept of respect. Because I don't know anyone in this world who wants to be tolerated. Imagine there were race riots or something at this university, which I'm sure was a political hotbed for all kinds of things. So one of your political leaders comes in and says, well, you're going to have to tolerate these kinds of people living amongst you, referring to people of a different background. Would that be acceptable? Would people feel happy? There is a difference, huge difference, between a call for tolerance and a call for respect. Now, classically, tolerance meant something very different. The classical doctrine of tolerare malice, which was a doctrine which was actually developed within the church from the ecclesiastical Latin that used to govern the life of the church, that idea of tolerare, where we got the English word tolerance from, meant something very different. The idea of tolerance there was, what do you do if you're head of the church, head of state, and head of army, and you have people who disagree with you? Can you use the army to get rid of people with whom you disagree? Or maybe could you just simply have them eliminated altogether so they just simply, poof, disappear? Now, some of our heated exchanges sometimes got so, the temperatures are so high in some of our debates right now, especially political debates, that some people would love to be able to do that. So then the question was asked, is that what the king should do? And the answer was no. Well, why not? Well, for a variety of reasons. Number one, if you think that they're fundamentally wrong and you think that as a result they may lose any chance they have of eternal life and you kill them, you're simply confirming them in that destiny. So they have no hope now. Number two, if you use force to shut them up, then other people will pretend to disagree with you even when they won't. So you'll close off all forms of debate and therefore lose your only chance of persuading them. And number three, you'll eventually lose the respect of the people around you because you'll command by fear as opposed to by being able to command through love and respect, and it's very different. Because if you only command through fear, people will obey you so long as they live in fear of you, but you don't know who you can trust. But when you command and lead through respect, people then follow you because they respect you and they have love for you, and therefore it's easier to win peace amongst the people. So the doctrine was, you must use your power, rather, O king, to defend the right of the one who disagrees with you, however unpopular he can be, from other people's attack. And if you do that, you'll open up a dialogue with the one with whom you disagree with, and therefore there's the possibility of persuasion. What's more, other people who share that opinion, which you are convinced is wrong, will also be prepared to talk with you, and there is the possibility of coming towards agreement. And you will also win the hearts of the people. Now, that idea of tolerance, if we want to recover that classical doctrine of tolerance, then I'm all in favor of it. But that's not normally how we use the word in our modern parlance today. And that's why one of the reasons why I think in terms of, if we're going to talk in modern language and just use our modern commonly accepted definitions, we may be much better off talking about respect than we may do about tolerance. But there's a bigger issue and a bigger problem with the way we talk about tolerance right now as we contemporarily understand it. We talk a lot about freedom as well in our society. We want a free society, but we also don't very often ask about what freedom is. Now again, we've come to define freedom negatively as opposed to positively. The way we define freedom negatively is we talk about absence of constraint. So, in other words, you move all forms of moral constraint, and then what you have is freedom. Now the challenge with thinking this way is if you pause about it long enough, you realize that freedom itself is a moral concept. It only exists within a moral framework. Freedom is not doing whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want to. That is not freedom, that is anarchy. Now, I've had the privilege of being invited to speak in various countries where anarchy has broken out. You can't walk down the street at almost any time of day simply because you can't guarantee you can get to the end of the street alive. When anarchy breaks out in a society, and everyone preys on everyone else, you don't have an increase of the amount of freedom within the society, you have the loss of it. Freedom is a moral concept. It only exists within a moral framework. That's why a couple of days after the American Declaration of Independence was signed, and obviously for me that was a very sad day, but when that document was signed, one of the signatures to that document in a sermon he preached in his church said, "Once a nation is equally poised, we must learn either to preserve our virtue or lose our liberty." Once a nation is equally poised, we must learn either how to preserve our virtue or lose our liberty. Now, there is a second way, therefore, of thinking about freedom, and that is, rather than the negative definition, freedom of constraint, the ultimate model of which would be a spaceman floating aimlessly in space, free of all forms of external constraint, yet powerless to move, would be a positive definition is being put into a framework which actually empowers you to move and change direction. If the spaceman wants to change, to make any form of movement, he has to come into contact with an external reality outside of himself against which he can push off. And that is precisely the kind of freedom that we need. We seem to live in an increasingly disempowered society in this day. We are in desperate need of having a framework which actually empowers us to see change and also know what is right. Which is why we start talking about the idea of if life is created and it is sacred and it is equal, then there are certain things which demand we are treated in certain ways, and if you violate that, you're violating something very precious. Now, at the moment, we're just talking about looking at various different types of definition. But there's one last part which we haven't really addressed the heart of the issue yet, which is what I want to come to now. And it's to do with this. I said in my introduction that I'm not sure whether the Home Office slogan was actually deliverable in the UK. And the reason is that there's one last problem with the way we talk about tolerance today that causes a fundamental problem. And it's not just simply to do with how we understand freedom or the loss of respect that we may then encounter. It's actually to do with the nature of justice. What does it mean to build a just society? Now, I've been thinking a little bit about this because one of the other criticisms that I frequently hear about the Christian faith is, okay, look, you're God and you all guys talk a lot about justice and you even talk about saying various things are wrong, but where's the love in that? How can that possibly be loving? And I'd like to suggest to you that actually these two things run much more closely together than we ever think. So let me just start off by just saying a couple of words about love. And I'd like to start by referring to a book that some of you would have heard of called Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen, which was then made into a 6-part BBC series that you may have seen. How many of you have seen the 6-part BBC adaptation? If you haven't seen it, chances are you're male and single. If you have seen it, you'll notice, no doubt, how much I resemble a guy called Mr. Darcy. If you're totally ignorant of it, let me just fill you in on some of the details. Pride and Prejudice has been one of the most endearing and popular love stories ever written in the English language. And recently, every time we mark a centenary or half-centenary of Jane Austen's life or the publication of this book, there's a huge media frenzy which often goes around the world. It tells the love story between a very brilliant, young and feisty woman called Elizabeth and a rather aloof, slightly proud man called Darcy. Now, Darcy falls in love with Elizabeth, but he doesn't quite realize it. And there's a scene which is portrayed very faithfully actually in the BBC adaptation, but very clearly described in the book, where Darcy comes to call on Elizabeth in her home, and he's shown into the main room, and she is unaccompanied. And as a British gentleman, protocol dictates he cannot be alone in a room with a woman to whom he is not married. And I'd just like to say, as the father of 2 daughters, I believe this is an absolutely essential requirement in any civilized society. So he apologizes. And he says, I am very sorry. If I knew you were unaccompanied, I would not have called. And he turns around and he starts to leave the room. And he's halfway out of the door when he stops. He then turns around, he re-enters the room, he looks at her, and he says, it will not do. My feelings cannot be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Now, gentlemen, listen carefully. That line is a winner. However, he goes on to say that he loves her even though it goes against his will, even though it goes against his reason, and even though it goes against his own better character. She then rejects this declaration of love, and being a man, he can't understand why. So he asks for an explanation. He says, I may inquire how you so easily reject me. To which she says, you told me that you loved me, even though it went against your will, even though it went against your reason, even though it went against all better character. In other words, she is saying, you told me that you loved me, even though it went against all better judgment. You see, true love doesn't exist in the absence of judgment. True love exists in the presence of it. The words I love you are meaningful because the person who has spoken them has making a true judgment about who you are. Now, most of us are so desperate in this world to be loved, we go around projecting an image of ourselves to other people hoping that they will like it. Now, the problem with this is that people fall in love with the image and never with the reality, which is why you can be very powerful, very rich, very popular, very beautiful, and yet terribly lonely. Because people only ever fall in love with the image and the aura surrounds you, and they never get to know the real you. Which is why it is possible to be so popular and so terribly lonely, because no one knows you. However, if there are a few people in this world who know the real you, they know all of your failings, your shortcomings, that darker side to your character, and yet they like you, they love you, those are the closest and most meaningful relationships you have. And when anything bad happens, but even more tellingly, when anything good happens, they're the very first people you want to share it with. True love doesn't exist in the absence of judgment. True love exists in the presence of it. Those words, I love you, are meaningful when they are spoken by someone who has passed a true judgment on the nature of your character. And that's exactly the way in which God loves us. He passes a true judgment on the nature of all of our characters. He sees exactly as we are, which makes his declaration of love over us all the more meaningful. Now, there is a group of philosophers who have actually written a fascinating treatise on this nature of love. You may be familiar with them. They're called the Black Eyed Peas. And they published this treatise actually now a couple of decades ago and entitled it, Where is the Love? I remember hearing it one day on the radio, and I decided to write some of it out. Let me quote them if I can. It says, people killing, people dying, children hurt, you hear them crying. Can you practice what you preach? Would you turn the other cheek? Father, 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 help us. Send us from guidance from above, because people have me questioning, where is the love? I feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. As I get older, people get colder. Most of us only care about money making. Selfishness got us following the wrong direction. Wrong information always shown in the media. Negative images are the main criteria. Although in their song they say negative images is the main criteria, but I've corrected the grammar there because it's not quite right. Infecting young minds faster than bacteria. Kids want to act like they see in the cinema. Whatever happened to the fairness of humanity? Whatever happened to fairness and equality? Instead of spreading love, we're spreading animosity, lack of understanding, leading lives away from unity. But here's the killer line that really made me sit up straight the first time I heard it. The truth is kept secret. It's swept under the rug. If you've never known truth, then you've never known love. And they're absolutely correct in what they say. If you've never known truth, then you've never known love. True love doesn't exist in the absence of judgment. True love exists in the presence of it. That's what makes it meaningful. When we set up a war between the nature of love and the nature of true judgment, we lose the risk of all real intimacy in life, because we're now looking for people to suspend all form of judgment when they actually come to love us, and when we actually want to be loved. And as I said, that's exactly how God loves us. So yes, it is true that God is a judging God. He looks into every single human heart and he sees exactly what is there. He sees all of our failings, our shortcomings, the terrible things done to us and the terrible things we've done to each other. But the Bible also says something very interesting about God too. It says that he is compassionate. Now that word compassion, God is a gracious and compassionate God. And by the way, if you think the God of the Old Testament has a moral problem, one of the oldest books of the Old Testament is the book of Jonah. We're not sure which is the oldest part of the Old Testament, but Jonah is part of a collection which is the oldest part of the Old Testament Bible. Jonah's problem with God is he's too compassionate. After God forgives a large number of people, Jonah says, God, exactly, this is why I don't like you. You're a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love. Now, that English word compassion also comes from the ecclesiastical Latin that used to govern the life of the church. It's a word that we invented in order to reflect that theological reality. You may notice I've got a thing for ecclesiastical Latin, but one day I'll grow out of it. Now, it's a compound word. Compassion means to make a moral judgment about a situation and be moved in your being to do something about it. So you have compassion in the face of racism when you make an absolute moral judgment. That is wrong. And then you are moved in your being to do something about it. If you're not moved to do anything about it, you don't have compassion, you have moralizing. You have compassion in the face of poverty. When you make an absolute moral judgment, that is wrong. It shouldn't look that way. And then you are moved in your being to do something about it. If you're not moved inside to do anything about it again, if it doesn't reach into your gut and compel you into action, you don't have compassion, you have moralizing and theorizing once more. When it says that God is gracious and compassionate, it means that as he looks into every human heart and sees the badness which is there, he makes an absolute moral judgment about it. He says, that is wrong. And then he is moved into the depth of his being to do something about it. And that is what Christians understand about the message of the cross. It is true that the idea of judgment is a central concept within the Christian faith. It's absolutely true. But you need to understand how it's connected in with the nature of love and justice. Now, what I started off by saying was, but isn't it intolerant to think this way? If God is so loving, why doesn't he just simply say, okay, look, I forgive everybody? Now, there's a challenge that you actually have when you think about mercy in any system of justice. And it's this, that by definition, when you're merciful, you're suspending justice. So, you get mercy is you do something wrong, you get caught, you should be punished, but we say, okay, we let you go. That's mercy, right? If you're not guilty, and you don't deserve to be punished, and I say, I forgive you, that's actually meaningless. Does that make sense? You don't deserve anything. You don't deserve to be punished. You haven't done anything wrong. You don't need mercy. Mercy is extended, therefore, always at the expense of justice. Whenever we extend mercy, we're suspending the requirements of justice and saying it doesn't matter. Which is why mercy is a complex theory within any system of justice, human justice, and also within any theology. Because in any religion of the world, when God exercises his mercy, he always does it at the expense of his justice. And that is true for every religion of the world apart from one. In the Christian faith, God doesn't exercise his mercy at the expense of his justice. God exercises his mercy through his justice. It is through the justice of the cross where God comes into this world and takes on our wrongdoing. Where our wrongdoing, what we have done wrong, where we have sinned, he takes on into himself, and he literally becomes sin for us. He totally identifies with us. And at that point of union with him, our sin becomes his. And he pays the price for which has been gone wrong. When God exercises mercy and forgiveness, he doesn't say it doesn't matter about that child molestation or that rape or that abuse. I'm just going to forgive it. He says it does matter. And justice should be done, and a price will be paid. But the incredible thing is that when God makes himself one with us, he bears the penalty on our behalf. And he pays the price and fulfills the requirement of justice. So when he forgives us, he doesn't do it at the expense of his justice, he does it through it. Which is why the Christian church doesn't have a doctrine of mercification, it has a doctrine of justification. It is through his justice that we are able to be forgiven. That's how important it is to him. Justice will be done, and it will be upheld. Through that, it's then possible to be reconciled to him and find peace. Now, there's one last aspect to this whole debate which I haven't touched on, which is to do with our attitude. Because there's another aspect of intolerance which bypasses some of the definitional things we've talked about, some of the philosophical things we've talked about, and some of the moral things we've talked about. It's much more to do with the heart. because we can use the word intolerance to describe an attitude, normally wrapped up in self-righteousness, maybe arrogance, possibly hatred, dismissiveness, which is incredibly ugly whatever culture you're in. The reason why that kind of attitude is banished from the Christian faith is that the nature of the Christian faith should be inherently humbling. If it's the case that through Christ God has paid for what we have done wrong, if it is the case that he loves us even though we may have done terrible things, and he is willing to forgive us and reconcile us to himself at his expense, not ours, and offer it to us as a gift that we can freely receive, it should humble us. It should change us. This is why the Apostle Paul, when he was writing a letter to the Galatians, which is amongst the earliest Christian literature in the New Testament, when he writes to the church, at one point he says, don't assume someone's a Christian because they say they're a Christian. If they are genuinely a Christian, there should be a fruit in their life. You should be able to taste their life, and it should have a certain flavor. And you should be able to, to make sense, almost like taste that fruit and tell it's genuine. So what Paul is basically saying to the church and to his critics is bite me, but in a very nice way. He's saying, taste and see what this tastes like. Because what this should taste of is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, and self-control. That's what this should taste of. If, however, when you taste this so-called fruit in someone's life, it's about envy, jealousy, malice, lust, anger, then you have every right to question the reality of what they're actually claiming in their life. Because it should look and taste fundamentally different. We're in desperate need in this world to recover compassion, true compassion. One of the reasons why I think we live in an increasingly compassionless world is we're incapable of making any sure moral judgments anymore. But there are some things in this world which are wrong. If we simply say we have to tolerate it, then we're going to do it at the expense of justice and say it doesn't matter. The challenge for us is, how do we build a safe, free, and just society, but one which also has hope for those who may have failed, however terribly, that there is the possibility of reconciliation and forgiveness, even though it comes at an incredible cost, which we ourselves don't have to pay. Now, just before we move into bed, I'd like to just finish, if I can, with a quote. I'll try and abbreviate it from you. It's from a guy you may have heard of called Martin Luther King. And he had an awful lot to say about this kind of stuff, and I'm going to abbreviate something which I saw a little while ago. I first read this actually in the museum, which is dedicated to his memory and commemorating his life. And it's entitled Letter to a Birmingham Jail. And if you go and Google Letter to a Birmingham Jail, you'll see how much I would have skipped out from what I'm about to read to you now. But just to give you the setting for the letter, Martin Luther King went down to Birmingham, Alabama in the United States to campaign against the injustice of racism. He was put in jail, and then he was criticized by some clergy for disturbing the peace. And they said, how can you, a clergyman, go on the streets and protest and go to jail? Shouldn't you uphold the law? Now, I didn't know that much about Martin Luther King, but the thing that amazed me about this letter is you have to remember he wrote this letter in jail. His lawyer came to visit him. He wrote out a letter. The lawyer smuggled it out in a folded up newspaper. So he had no books. He had no references. What he wrote in this letter had to come out of his memory and his heart. And I don't think up until that point had realized how much he was carrying in his heart and how much he'd thought about this subject matter until I saw this letter on the wall, and it moved me to tears. And I'd love to read you all of it, except it will take about 10 minutes. And so I'm just going to give you some sections. So he's been criticized. Why have you come all the way here to cause trouble? And he says, I am here because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, I am compelled to carry a gospel of freedom far beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. People tell me that I should wait and not be so impatient, but justice too long delayed is justice denied. You'd express a great deal of anxiety about my willingness to break the law. This is certainly a legitimate concern. Since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in schools, at first glance it may seem rather paradoxical for us to break the law. You may say, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of law, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying a just law. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust law. And I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. What is the difference between the two? How do you determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law of God. An unjust law is a code which is out of harmony with that moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in the eternal and natural law. I hope you're able to see this distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would a rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks that law when his conscience tells him it is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. Of course, there is nothing new about this. It was evident sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if you don't know who those are, you need to get your type them into the dictionary. You can read the Bible passages in the book of Daniel. I'll give you a clue. And, yes, it's a jet lag. It was evidenced refusally in their refusal to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by early Christians who were willing to face the lions and the excruciating pain of the chopping block rather than submit to the unjust laws of the Roman Empire. I have reached the most regrettable conclusion that our great stumbling block in our side is not the white citizens' councillor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace in the absence of tension to a positive peace with the presence of justice. More and more I feel that people of ill will have used time more effectively than us. You say our activity here is extreme. At first I was disappointed to hear this. I began thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in our community. One is one of complacency and the other one of hatred. I am trying to stand in the middle. We now live in a world where people have lost faith in our country, who have absolutely repudiated Christianity, and who have concluded that this is all incorrigible. I try to stand between these forces, saying we should emulate neither the do-nothingness of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the nationalist. For there is nothing... There we go. What did I do there? For there is a more excellent way of love, and I am grateful to God that through the influence of the church, the way of non-violence has now become an integral part of our struggle. If it had not, the streets of the South would now be flowing in blood. But let me take note of my other disappointment, which is with the church. He said, I say these things as the grandson and son of the church, who was nurtured in the church, who was a minister of the gospel, who was nurtured in its bosoms, in its bosom. In the midst of this struggle, to rid ourselves of justice, I've heard people say, don't concern yourself with these social issues. That's got nothing to do with the gospel. And I've watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which makes an unbiblical distinction between the body and the soul, between the sacred and the secular. But I have wept over this. Be assured that my tears are tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment where there is no love. I love the church. How could I do otherwise? There was a time when the church was powerful. In the early days of Christianity, Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of a nation. It was the thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Christians pressed on in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than to obey man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to ancient injustices, such as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. Things are different now. The contemporary church is so often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structures of the average community consoled by its silent and even vocal sanction of the way things are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into disgust. But I hope the church will rise to meet this decisive hour. Never before have I written such a long letter. I'm afraid it is too much to take your precious time. I can assure you it would have been much shorter if I'd been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when he is alone in a prison cell, rather than write long letters, think long thoughts, and pray long prayers? I hope this letter finds you strong in your Christian faith. I hope that the circumstances will soon make it possible for me to each one of you, not as an integrationist or civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. There's so much in that letter which rings true of contemporary thought today. So I'd like to finish my talk with you with two challenges. First of all, to all of those who can count yourselves as being within the church, who would say you are Christians. And my challenge to you would be, does your life and your earnestness, the focus in your devotion, match up to the price that Christ was prepared to pay to secure your forgiveness? Are you willing to make a stand, to speak up when you know things are wrong, however unpopular it may be, and to lovingly and willingly bear a penalty, knowing that one day we'll stand before one who will judge all of us in truth and love? Is it possible that parts of the church need to repent today of our complacency and our refusal to make a stand and to stand with the one who called us? If that is you, and your Christian faith has become nothing more than a membership of a social club, I want to remind you again of why Christ came into this world, was to pay a price that we could not possibly hope to pay, extend a love to us which we never deserved, and change us and set us in a whole new direction that we may live differently to him. And maybe you need to give yourself afresh to him this evening. Now, of course, there will be many of you here who would think of yourself as being both outside of the church and maybe even outside of the Christian faith. And I guess there are three possible responses to what you've heard this evening. The first one will be no. Everything you said is wrong, or most of it is wrong. I fundamentally disagree with you. I want to raise some objections and questions, and we're going to have a time to do that in a minute, and someone will come round with a microphone. You'll be able to raise your question, raise your objection. I'll do my very best that I can to answer it. We'll do that for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'll hang around here afterwards and try and continue the conversations one-on-one until eventually I fall asleep, or that I start making so many verbal slippages I'm not making sense anyway, so you don't want to talk to me anyway. The second response could be maybe. Maybe this is true, but I'm not sure. Well, I would love to extend to you the possibility to find out. And if you would like to find out more, then my suggestion is come and speak to Gary, who introduced, or forgive me your name again, Bronte, the medical students. And they would love to find a way to meet with you, maybe put you in a discussion group where you can explore the Christian faith and discover what it is actually about and whether it's true, where you can decide for yourself. But if your answer isn't no, and your answer isn't maybe, the other logical possibility is yes. I actually believe this is true. Now, maybe it's possible you've thought of yourself as a Christian, but you actually realize you're on the outside looking in. Or maybe you've been thinking about this for a while, and while you've been here this evening, it's almost as if God himself, it feels to you, has reached into his hand into your life and placed it on your heart. And you know you need to say yes to him. You're aware both of the forgiveness he offers, the means by which he secured it through the cross, and you know you need to say yes to him, and you want to say sorry to him and receive his forgiveness, and then commit your life to walk with him and follow him, whatever it may cost you. And if that is the response that you're making this evening, then the way to do that is just through a very simple prayer, where you just come before God, acknowledge your own need for forgiveness, thank him for what he has done, and say yes to him. So I said, in a moment, we're going to have the time to ask questions and objections. Afterwards, there'll be opportunity, if you want to find out more, to come and talk, and we'll put you into a discussion group so you can continue the conversation. But if you know you need to say yes, then I'd invite you just to pray this very short prayer with me now as you sit here. So I may invite you just to take a moment. If it helps you just to think through or contemplate, you may want to shut your eyes. If you do that, put your hand on your purse or your wallet. We live in a fallen and depraved world, and you have no idea who's sat next to you. And I would invite you just in that moment to know if that's what you need to say to him, then simply, why not pray this prayer along with me? And if that is who you are, maybe just as the other people around are not looking, so you can have a moment of privacy. There's nothing magical in this, but if you want to just slip up your hand and say, look, I'm praying this with you, then I know who I'm praying for. But let's just pray this. Father, I am sorry for what I have done, and I am grateful to the price you paid and how you came into this world in the person of Christ to pay the price for me. I know I need your forgiveness, and I want to receive it. I welcome you into my life, and I will follow you, however much it may cost me, and whatever it may demand of me. Amen. Well, you've actually listened very well. I think all of you are still awake. If someone fell asleep next to you, this is the time to wake them up, because this is where they get the opportunity to ask questions. So I think Gary's got a microphone you're going to walk around with. If you want to take a moment, if you would like to write out a question so you can read it out, that's fine. If you'd like to write out a question and you don't like the idea of speaking in public, get someone else to read it out for you. Otherwise, if you raise your hand, Gary will walk over to you with the microphone. And if what we could do is, if you can try and keep the question as tightly as you can, that will allow us to get through as many questions. I said I'm going to do this probably for about 15, 20 minutes. I was once at one of these events, someone asked a question which lasted 18 minutes. It was a very difficult question, but I was so happy because I had no opportunity to respond. I just thanked everyone for coming and we left. So the tighter you can keep the question, the more we may be able to get through, and we'll try and cover as much ground as possible. Gary, does anybody have a question? Apart from, why did I bother coming tonight? Okay, I can see all the way right at the very back in the middle over there. I can see a gentleman with his hand up in the air. Did you see that? Do you want to put it up a little higher? So I think Gary's a little lower than you.
My name is Bill. This is not so much a question as a comment. My father marched with Dr. Martin Luther King in Alabama. And I'd just like to encourage everyone to read the whole letter. And just to make one clarification, because even from the lips of the current United States president, there's a certain myth that's developed. And that myth is that the current redefinition of marriage is the successor to the civil rights movement of Reverend Martin Luther King. And that is patently false.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment.
And because Reverend Martin Luther King was first and foremost a minister of the gospel that you have so beautifully and eloquently proclaimed tonight. And so there was an unequivocal position on his part that marriage is between one man and one woman. I just thank you very much for bringing his message to us tonight and the gospel as well. Thank you.
You have a written one?
Yeah.
Okay.
I spent all day writing it.
It's always nice to know you came up with a question before the talk.
Well, actually, I've been YouTubing you for a couple of years now, so I'm fairly familiar with the speech. And sticking in line with our civil rights movement and the marriage equality question, although I'm not going to ask you about your opinion on marriage equality, it is related. So thanks very much for your presentation. I do have to admit I have been stalking you on YouTube for a few years. And I find your views around tolerance and respect actually very refreshing. I think you're a bit of a left-wing Christian apologist, in my opinion. So I want to talk about the marriage equality debate here in Australia. So in 2011, 61.1% of Australians said that they were Christian. 39% said that they actually were Christians that did anything in their church. So practicing, I guess you could say, or applying it. In fact, in this census, it looks like atheism will be the #1 response to what is your religion or no religion in the Australian census. The powerful Christian lobby in Australia, the Australian Christian Lobby, the ACL, has submitted 3 requests to the federal government to suspend hate speech during our upcoming marriage equality plebiscite. They've also asked for $30 million in taxpayers' funding, which is about 3 times the total expenditure of the last advertising campaign for all political parties for federal election, in an effort for them to speak what they want to speak.
You do realise my knowledge about Australian politics is rather
well,
limited.
that's why I'm painting a picture for you. I've got some facts here for you if you like. I can bring them down. But at the end of the day, the Australian Christian lobby is campaigning very heavily against marriage equality. Australia is a secular society with separation of church and state in our constitution, and it turns out that the biggest religious denomination in Australia now is atheism. Do you think that the Australian Christian lobby, in its bid to get $30 million worth of taxpayers' money to fight for marriage inequality, and its request 3 times to the federal government to suspend hate speech for the plebiscite debate, do you think that's an example of Christian intolerance?
I have absolutely no idea, partly because I'm too uninformed to be able to answer with any detail. The only thing I would pick up on is I know, having seen another study, actually was done in the Australian context, that when people tick they have no religion, by no means at all does that actually mean atheism. The study which I saw, which was actually quite extensive, was the majority of those who take no religion actually believed in God, but they didn't want to describe themselves as being part of a particular denomination or grouping. They saw it as something very personal. So I think one of the things that's...
They've broken that down, so we actually had that data, and it's about 3% who say that they believe in God, they don't believe in a particular religion, the rest don't believe in God.
Really? So you're saying out of that?
It's on the Jurisprudence website.
I'll have a look at it. I mean, I became aware of a survey that was done here 18 months ago that was actually quite extensive and got a lot of wide publicity, which would more or less argue the exact opposite of that. And that's one of the problems with these statistics that can be, depending on who wants to produce them and what they want to say, you can twist them round. So I think it's a very dangerous thing to do. I know we had a similar situation in the UK, and again, when it was drilled down into, it was found to be a very similar issue. The number of atheists hadn't increased rather a lot, but the number of people who thought of themselves as being unaffiliated but believed in some kind of personal God or higher power and prayed to it and all this kind of stuff was actually still very high within that category. And that seemed to be paralleled in what was done in Australia just over a year ago. So that bit, I feel very free to comment on. All the other bits that you're talking about, I think there is one thing that I would raise, which I would add into this, which I don't know if it will answer your question at all. It may be coming in a roundabout way. There is an incredible book, which I'm only halfway through reading, and it's always dangerous to comment on a book you're only halfway through reading, through an Oxford University law professor. Now, they have a website which is called, I think it's called freespeechdebate.com. Have any of you come across that? Can anyone remember if that's the right URL? Anyway, what they are doing is they're looking at the challenges which have been now posed across the Western world into free speech. Now, the reason that they've been writing is that we're now living in what some people describe as a culture of victimhood. And in a culture of victimhood, the overwhelming narrative is everything I do is motivated by love, and anyone who disagrees with me is motivated only by hate. So anyone who disagrees with me is therefore guilty of some huge crime. Now, we had this happen in the UK fairly recently when a well-known feminist atheist called Germaine Greer made her views on transgenderism known. Now, she didn't say them very well, and they weren't very polite, and I suppose one of the things where I tend to disagree with a lot of people at the moment, where people want to defend the right to be rude about people, and I think that is true. We have to defend that. I just don't think we should encourage it. She then got no platform from Cardiff University. So then a guy in England called Peter Tatchell spoke up in her defense and said it was wrong of the NUS to no platform her. Now, because the student who had made the decision to no platform Germaine Greer was gay, he said that because Peter Tatchell disagreed with him, Peter Tatchell was homophobic and was denounced and voted down by the student body as being a homophobe. Now, anyone who knows anything about Peter Tatchell, who's campaigned for gay marriage in the UK for 35 years and so on, and to describe him as a homophobe is, in my opinion, intellectually out to lunch. So he got no platform. So then Richard Dawkins then spoke up in defense of Peter Tatchell and said, you're utterly crazy to defend, to no platform Peter Tatchell. You shouldn't no platform Germaine Greer either. So guess what happened to him? Now, one of Britain's sort of leading scientist atheists who's on British TV a lot, called Brian Cox, Professor Brian Cox, he's spoken up in defense of Richard Dawkins and so on, and there's no end to it. Now, the reason why I'm using this illustration is that this particular debate's got nothing to do with God, Christianity, or anything like that. It's to do with the ability to express differing academic opinions on university campuses without being no-platformed and denied the right. Or, if you disagree with someone, to equate that with, therefore, you hate me. Which is why all of these studies being done on victimhood and why this Oxford University study is really very fascinating. Because what the Oxford University law professor is saying is if we extend this, it's the end of free speech. And it's the end of all free academic thought. Universities and democratic societies must flourish on a free exchange of different ideas where people can listen to competing arguments and then decide accordingly. Now, if that culture does take off, we're in huge difficulty. Now, classically, the West was seen wedged between two different types of culture. We used to talk about cultures of honor. So in an honor culture, you acted in a way to preserve your honor. So if your honor was attacked, you would act to preserve it. Now, that could be anything from Julian at dawn, which I'm not very keen on. I like to resolve my conflicts with food, wine, and a long conversation rather than fighting, but I have a body that was built for food, it seems, rather than fighting, hence my preference. But honor was very important, and you would defend your honor, and we would think in categories of honor, and you would earn respect from others by acting in an honorable way. Now, in contrast to that, we would also talk about cultures of dignity. Now, dignity cultures were different from honor cultures. Dignity cultures would say, no, I don't need to earn people's respect by the way in which I act. Because of the very nature of being a human being, I have a certain human dignity that should be respected, and you should actually give it to me. But dignity demands that I conduct myself in a certain way, and actually I may choose not to defend my honor. Someone may attack me, but actually for the cause of the society, and maybe in order to bring about reconciliation, I may choose not to defend myself in order to bring a group of people together so there can be some form of reconciliation. But that would actually be, if you like, valued within the society. Does that make sense? Because it was a dignified way to respond to a particular attack. And Western culture in particular was seen as wedged somewhere between these two. That makes sense? Hovering somewhere between an honor culture and a dignity culture. Now, the key difference between honor and dignity culture versus victimhood culture is in honor and dignity cultures, you don't make constant third-party appeals for other people to settle your disputes. So in an honor culture, you don't go around asking other people to come and solve a problem for you because that wouldn't be honorable. You meant to do that. Similarly, in a dignity culture, you wouldn't go around talking about how upset or painful you may feel about something because that wouldn't be dignified. That's something that you would have to somehow process yourself and then find a way to positively go forward. In victimhood cultures, what the studies show, and there's quite a lot of debate about this, so if you Google this, you'll find all kinds of papers now coming out of places like Yale and Harvard, and as well as Oxford and various others looking at this. But in victimhood cultures, we make third-party appeals all the time. So the way we win support is by portraying how badly more of a victim we feel. Now, the psychology of this has been, and this is what this Oxford University study is particularly interested in, is that the surveys seem to show that when we're in a victimhood mentality, we're willing to either exaggerate facts or even invent them out of thin air because we're so convinced about the rightness of our cause, we don't really care about the rightness of the means. In other words, okay, if I have to change the facts or if I have to lie, that's okay because the nature of the thing that I'm campaigning for is so valuable, lying to get there is okay. And again, that's something which has become a source of huge academic debate. And there have been some crazy things which have happened in the last few years, which I would want to defend and say, look, I don't necessarily agree with this, but this is crazy. I mean, the leading Canadian university that banned the practice of yoga on its campus. Now, I don't believe in the practice of yoga, and if it's spiritually done, I might even want to say I don't think it's spiritually good for you, but then a lot of people will disagree. I'm happy to have the conversation. But they banned it. Why? Well, because it's practiced by white people who've culturally appropriated it from India, and that's in cultural imperialism. That's equivalent to racism and hatred, and anyone who practices it is therefore guilty of hatred, so they banned it from their campus. Or the British University campus, which banned out a Mexican restaurant from handing out sombreros to students who brought a takeaway meal on the same grounds that therefore it was cultural appropriation, it was therefore racism, it was hate speech, it was banned on their platforming policy. These things are crazy. And I'm very glad that a large number of people around the world are speaking out against it, not just Christians, atheists, agnostics, all kinds of people, academics. And I'm very pleased to see that the University of Chicago last week Oxford University a couple of months ago and various others around the world have said, we can't even go. We actually reject this ideology. If you come to our university, you're going to find competing ideas that make you feel uncomfortable. You're going to have to learn to reason, think it through, and then respond. Now, the only reason why I'm making that long thing there, and I'm not to say this is how you're thinking at all, but with a lot of these very sensitive issues that we have going on right now, this whole, well, what I'm doing is motivated by love and anyone who disagrees with me is motivated by hate is becoming a very common thing. The clinical narcissism is spiraling upwards at a huge rate, which is why there are a lot of now psychiatric academic papers saying, why is narcissism rising in the rest of the world at such an astronomical pace? We're talking about hundreds of percentages of increases. So why is it multiplying? And the discussion then is this affecting our ability to have meaningful disagreement with each other? How as a society do we learn to disagree without becoming disagreeable? And we have to find a way to do that. So I can't speak into all the details of it because I'm just simply too uninformed. That's why I've sort of tried to take a step back. Now, having said that, I would want to make a very strong plea. I think if hate speech means inciting violence, against people, makes sense? Bullying them, and so on, we have to, that's wrong. But if hate speech means you disagree with me, therefore you hate me, now we have a problem. Because it means we can't have any form of intellectual disagreement anymore, and someone's going to have to decide what the intellectual consensus is, and then everybody will have to buy into it. Now, as to your other point, again, I don't have to take one step back. The two readers I've been rereading recently, so if you're stalking me on the internet, you'll hear me quoting them more and more. And I'm happy to have this conversation because I'm actually thinking about trying to write about this for the first time next year, try to write something book length. And then you don't have to stalk me on the internet. You can scribble on my book and turn it into paper aeroplanes. But in the 60s and 70s, because of communism being such a big ideology then, and it's on the rise again now, but it was obviously with the Soviet Union, there was a lot of debate between liberty and equality. And people like Isaiah Berlin, Karl Popper, and a lot of other brilliant minds around the world were debating about this. But there was an agreement that, okay, you've got absolute liberty on one hand and absolute equality on the other. And we need to fulcrum the two. Does that make sense? So if you've got a society which is totally libertarian, we'll see a large amount of inequality. If you have a state-enforced equality, you give everybody the same income, does that make sense? And it's state-enforced, you have a huge amount of equality, but at the expense of liberty. So how do we fulcrum the two? If we need to find a balance between liberty and equality, where's the moral fulcrum which allows you to decide, well, how do we balance these two competing political ideals? And of course, there were a few people at either extreme who advocated one against the other, but most were trying to, slide this fulcrum along to say, well, I think we should balance it here. Now, in Western politics, we balanced it slightly towards liberty versus equality. Does that make sense? Okay, we're going to set up a freedom that has an awful lot of liberty in it, and that will probably mean there'll be more social inequality, economic inequality, but we think that's better than fulcruming it more towards the equality end. Does that make sense? At the loss of liberty. Now, right now, we're having debates about moving this fulcrum. But sadly, as far as I can see, there's no express debate, as there was back in the 60s and 70s, and hence no clear thinking about what are we pitting against each other, and what are the long-term impacts and consequences within a society. Now, that's not to say that obviously I have my own personal convictions, and I'm happy to defend them. So that's not to say that we shouldn't allow people to advocate on both sides. It was just people were consciously doing it. Now we seem to be subconsciously doing it. And I think it's one of the reasons, again, why the debate is so confused. Does that make sense? We're not thinking in a big enough picture to try to figure out what is the role of the state in a lot of the debates that we're actually having. And so that's going to be an ongoing issue. At the very least, if you could drop your question to me with your URL, because I'd love to see the figures on there, because with the jet lag, I've already forgotten what you told me, what your website, what the website you referred to. I'd love to have a look at it. But I don't know if any of that sort of makes sense. I mean, I suppose my one plea would be, whatever happens here in Australia, is we simply, if we're going to live in a civilized society, we have to find a way to have important debates where we don't demonize each other, where we try to find a way to have a meeting of the minds, and when there's disagreement, to figure out what it means to be able to disagree without becoming disagreeable in the process. Otherwise, our society is going to become cannibalistic, and we're going to destroy ourselves in the process. this is so much more I can say, but I'm not running for political office myself right now. But if you like the sound of what I'm saying and you think I have a shot in Australia, drop me a line and I'll consider emigrating. I'm always open to a better offer.
Michael, can I just pick up very briefly on one aspect of the question, which I think is quite important, just your comments about your understanding of church and state, the separation thereof.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and that's very interesting, because obviously what Martin Luther King was saying, and I know it's very controversial, is ultimately there can be no such thing. So within jurisprudence, which I used to teach, there are different schools. So jurisprudence is the moral theory of law. Does that make sense? Is there a connection between morality and law? And there's one school of jurisprudence which says no. Does that make sense? There is no connection between morality and law, and there never should be. The law is the law is the law. So whatever the state passes is law, and that's the law. And you can't talk about an unjust law or a just law. There's just law. Okay? On the other end of the spectrum, you have a group of scholars who say no, there is a moral component to law, and governments may enact whatever laws they want, that's true, and they may enforce them through the power of the state. But that doesn't make them just. Okay? Just and unjust is answered by a different debate. Okay? And it's going to involve some kind of moral thinking. Now, there are a lot of different ways to get to these two different positions, and I won't outline all of them to you. But if you believe it is possible for there to be such a thing as an unjust law, a law which is actually morally wrong, then at that point, you're going to have to admit that you're arguing for some connection between our moral thinking and what should and shouldn't be law. Now, therefore, in that sense, you never have any true separation, not simply between church and state, you never have any true separation between our moral thinking and our political thinking and our legal thinking. So, in that sense, what Martin Luther King was saying, which is those who say, well, look, those were affairs of state, and that's the secular world, and we're just simply concerned with the church, and that's the spiritual world, that's what he was rallying against in that speech. That's what he was denouncing. And he was saying, if you're a Christian, you can't possibly believe that. Because as a Christian, you must realize that some laws are going to be moral, and some are going to be wrong, some you're going to have to fight to support, some you have to fight to implement, and some you have to fight to oppose, and you have to be willing to go to jail in the process. Okay, that's what he was saying. And I think that is correct. So if we mean separation of church and state to mean if I'm a church minister, does that mean therefore I should be the only person allowed to rule the country? I think that's a very bad idea, and I'm not sure that that's what we're talking about. That's to do about who holds political power. But if we're talking about a moral commentary and critique, of the state or the law, then actually we're doing that all the time. And so even in the debate to which we've just referred, different sides would say, I think the law as it currently stands is unfair and should be changed. And other people would say, no, I believe the law as it currently stands is fair and should be preserved, right? But that whole talk about fairness and justice, that's a moral judgment we're making at that point. So very sadly, what's happened in the West is that we've rejected almost all forms of moral thinking at a time when we need to make moral judgments as never before. And therefore, we can't find any common basis on which to have moral discussion. So I don't know if that helps answer your particular question. So if we're talking about, yes, because I'm a clergyman, that means I should automatically run the country, no. I just don't see that either in Scripture or anywhere else. But if what we mean is, should there be a commentary on the affairs of state, then absolutely yes. And as a matter of fact, that's what we all do. And I would want to defend the right of any group to make sense to argue what it thinks is morally right, and therefore put it into practice. I mean, I was joking when I was talking about how I want my daughters to be treated, right? But that's because whoever they end up with, I want that person to treat them as a person, not as an object. Okay, which is why I have a moral objection to pornography. I think it objectifies people and reduces them into objects. And the difference between the relationship between you and an object is one of consumption, whereas the relationship between you and another person is one of connection. Pornography seems to reduce people into objects, and we consume them for our pleasure. And we lose sight of the person in the process. And I think that's ultimately demeaning to everybody. Now, as I make that comment, I'm making some psychological comments that may be true or false, and they can be academically debated. But I'm also making some moral judgments, which I think can also be debated. Does that make sense? And defended one way or another. And it's important we find a way to have that conversation. Well, I did say that if we went, I was going to suggest we take in 8 questions, and do you want to do any more? Or, I mean, we're now 20 past. I've been speaking for 25 minutes. Do you want me to keep going? Okay, one more. Some of you may need to bail at this point. We'll be finished by midnight. I mean, I have to be up at at 7. So.
G'day. I was just wondering.
What's your name? Start off with you.
Callum. Sorry.
Callum. Nice to meet you, Callum.
G'day. I was just wondering, particularly with the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, is there a Christian justification for war?
Thank you for your easy question. Okay. Gosh. All right. I have such an unpopular answer to this. I think the answer to it is yes. One of the most fluent and brilliantly written books I've read in the last 10 years, and I'm not just saying that lightly or whatever, is written by an Oxford University professor by the name of Nigel Biggar, who is a professor of ethics at the University of Oxford and also a professor of theology. And he wrote a book called In Defense of War, which is a provocative title. Now, it is a very controversial book, right, in the sense of I also know 1 or 2 other academics who I massively respect who have huge issue with it. So if you Google In Defense of War, Nigel Biggar, you will also find plenty of critique of what he said. But what I will say at a personal level is when I read that book, I can remember thinking if I could ever write a book that is as well researched as that, as heavily footnoted as that, and as easy to read as that, I would be so happy it would be untrue. I mean, how many of you here are students? I don't know. I mean, one of the most painful thing about students is reading books that are very boring, right? And you just have to do it. And it's painful. And I know it's painful and it's really hard. But have you ever read an academic article or a book and you just fall in love with it because it's just so well written and you just follow it and it flows? And it's just so beautiful to read, isn't it? Because compared to all the stuff you have to trudge through, you know, and sort of force yourself to read and you feel sick and you get halfway through the chapter and you sort of skip to the next one hoping it'll get better and it's only worse. And then you begin questioning the whole purpose of your existence. But anyway, that's enough about my life. Everyone, even if you read the most voracious critic of Nigel Biggar, they will say it's probably one of the most eloquently written academic books they've read in a long time. Some would say in their entire lifetime. I think it will be a classic and it will still be read in 100 years' time from now. So first of all, if you want a really well-reasoned thing, have a look there. The thing with ISIS is a little bit more complicated. I was in a meeting when what was called the so-called Arab Spring started. There were about 15 people around the table. And I'm not sure why I was invited to be there. I think I was invited to be there because most people around the table were saying this is the Arab Spring and it's going to be like the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And I said, no, I think this is going to be a bloodbath and it's going to spiral out of control. So I was the dissenting voice in the room. And I have to say, I went in, I think, with slightly the wrong attitude. The guy sitting next to me was the British Foreign Secretary, and I can remember thinking, well, what's he got to say? You know, another politician, here we go. And there were various people from various different security agencies, both from the West and actually also from the Middle East around the table, and it was to have a closed discussion about what was going on. Now, I think he'd be happy me quoting this. But when the British Foreign Secretary started to speak, I found myself leaning down into my bag to find a piece of paper and a pen because I was so surprised. I couldn't have been more surprised by his opening line. His opening line was, hypocrisy is the new global unforgivable sin. And I think he's right. He said, what we're seeing in the Middle East right now is an extreme anger in the people and everywhere at the hypocrisy of the lifestyle of their leaders and even their religious leaders who advocate one thing and live another. And it's reached boiling point. I mean, you could have knocked, the second thing he said also I found equally surprising, because his next statement was, and the West is so theologically illiterate. We don't understand what we ourselves think or believe, let alone them. And we've totally failed to talk with them in any meaningful way in the last 25 years. You know. Now, I mean, I would have leant over and given the guy a hug, but, you know, he's English and I'm half Middle Eastern, and he probably would have had a heart attack at that point. You know, because as you know, the British just don't do that. I actually was in church 2 weeks ago and I heard a guy preaching on the passage, greet one another with a brotherly kiss. And the guy said, now what does that mean today? He said, in my personal experience, I've always found that a warm handshake more than suffices in any social situation you're in. Oh my goodness. So, So I think there's something very different which is happening in that part of the world. Now, you referenced ISIS, which is even more particular still. Because obviously there'll be plenty of people who live in that part of the world who have a problem themselves with ISIS. Does that make sense? They live in fear of it, and they wish it wasn't there. I will say one thing, because again, it also connects into the overall theme that I talked about. Let me try and set it up with this illustration. I was in London 2 years ago, and I was meeting with the British Army General who wanted to ask me a lot of difficult questions. And after 3 hours of him pummeling me with questions, I said, okay, can I ask you one? And he said, okay. I said, when I was 15, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I gave myself to it, and I worked really hard. I was committed to something. Now, when I became a Christian, my commitments changed, and I went in a different direction, but I was still working hard to achieve something. I said, well, forget about being 15 or even 25. I now meet people who are 35, and they're drifting through life. They don't know what to do. They're not committed to anything. They drift in and out of jobs and studies. And my question to you is, how do you breed leadership in the absence of commitment? And he went absolutely quiet, and then he said, you don't know this about me. For the last few years of my life, I was in charge of officer training and selection for British Armed Services, and this was our number one problem. We couldn't find people who were sufficiently committed, who we could train to be effective leaders. And then we talked about why that was the case. An hour later, I was in a shop in London, and I was at the counter, and the guy next to me was talking to the guy, and I heard his accent, and I said, oh, are you from America? And he said, yes, I am. I said, what are you doing here? I said, oh, I'm on holiday. And then I said, what do you do? He said, well, I'm retired now. He says, but I used to help run the LAPD. And I said, oh, I know exactly what you do. I've seen all the movies. And he fell about laughing. We sat down in a chair. We started talking. And about half an hour, I said, do you mind if I ask you a question? I was just with the guy, and I asked him the same question. So I set it up in the same way I asked the same question. He looked at me and he said, for the last few years of my life, I was in charge of officer training for the LAPD. He said, we spent millions of dollars flying in motivational speakers, cultural analysts, all kinds of people to help us think it through. We never solved this problem. We now have officers who don't command the respect of the rank and file underneath them. They're willing to give it a go, but they're not committed, and it's our number one problem. Now, why am I saying this in terms of ISIS? Any form of commitment is a moral process. You commit yourself to something which you think is important and true and just. And you will give yourself wholeheartedly to it if you think the leaders who are leading you embody that level of commitment themselves. In a world that seems to be so bereft of committed leadership, people will romanticize groups like ISIS, and they will give themselves to a group of people who seem utterly committed to achieve their ends, and join them and support them, even if they've been fooled into the wrongness of their cause. There is a huge need in our world today. And for those of you who are students, one of the reasons why your moral thinking is so important is you must think through what ends are morally justifiable, what means are morally justifiable to achieve them. I'd urge you to seek out some people in leadership who embody and live that, and be committed to something. Otherwise, you're just going to drift through this world, and we're in a world that's bereft of leadership right now in many ways. So sorry, I've answered it in 3 different ways, because actually there are 3 different components. But that whole thing about the importance of commitment and leadership, I think, is very important. It's what compassion is ultimately about, making a moral judgment and being moved to do something about it. It is also then about thinking through the consequences of our worldview and knowing on what basis we're prepared to make very tough decisions, including ones about do we go to war or not. And that's another set of moral frameworks. It's not just legal. There's also, is it right or not? And we have to be able to answer that and speak up if we think it's wrong. And then we also just have to rethink through the nature of what it means if we live in a compassionless society that is scared to make any form of moral judgment, because it's just drifting through everything in life. It's a very profound question for me. I hope that answer helps. How are we doing on time? You want me to wrap up?
We might take one brief question with a brief answer.
Okay.
This is
all right. Ladies and gentlemen, I gladly accept your nomination to run as President of Australia. No, Prime Minister. My goodness, I've outed myself as a Republican accidentally. I actually believe in the monarchy.
Michael, thank you. My name's Brendan. You've talked about social justice issues and also proclaiming the gospel.
Yeah.
How can a church prioritise both of those
Wow.
and do it well?
It's a good question. And I think the answer is we can't see it as neither or. If we're going to talk about social justice, what we're saying is what is right and wrong in a society, which means we need to figure out what is right and what is wrong. Right? It also means we need to decide what is the ultimate thing that's capable of changing and transforming a society. Now, from my understanding, the proclamation of the gospel is what changes and transforms. The social justice is the outworking, does that make sense, of that transformation in any given society. So, to seek the transformation of the individual without the outworking into a society is to truncate the gospel. Does that make sense? That's what Martin Luther King was talking about, and that's what we call hypocrisy. Well, you believe one thing, but you don't do anything about it. Or you believe one thing, or even worse, you do another. So where's that follow-through and that consistency? So I think we need to find a way for it to be lived out, completely, which is why I think the Christian life is very challenging. Which is why I think it's actually important for the church to be morally challenged about what it's doing or not doing, thinking or not thinking. And also itself called to repentance or action, or whatever it may be, in order to keep that in balance. So I think the answer is I don't think we're given the option, to make sense, of focusing on one or another. We have to be committed to all of it, as a group and as a body. And if we fail to do so, then people begin to ask questions like, well, it doesn't seem to make any difference. Because it doesn't make any difference. And that's a very valid critique. So I think, so the brief answer is, yes, no, I think they go hand in hand. One flows out of the other. So let's not stop doing one. Let's not stop the outflow of the other. And then let's find a way then to be honest about when we're doing well and what we can learn from each other and when we're failing and we can do it differently. Well, look, you've all listened so well, and I feel very badly. I know food was promised to you later, and that's maybe some of the only reason why you came. It's probably the highlight of the evening. I've actually enjoyed being here. Thank you very much. I will hang around at the front and turn off my microphone if you want to come and speak to me personally. I'll be down here for a while, although at some point the jet lag will kick in, and I might fall into your arms. Don't take that as any kind of approach. That's just what happens physically when you can't stand anymore. Good night, and enjoy the rest of your evening.